get started. And I want to apologize for the technical glitches, which are clearly they're not glitches in the sense of technology, but rather in the sense of obviously my head. And I think we've just come up on essentially a year of lockdown.
Rudolph, is that the one?
And it's definitely affecting, I'm sure it's affecting you, it's definitely affecting me. So I want to start also by just checking in with people and seeing how everyone's doing. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember a time before this. This is just so my normal that it's not like, it doesn't feel bad. It feels fine because it's life. And we're like, it's, I don't know. It's okay having small kids and we live in our little bubble of I'd be in this isolated bubble regardless with 3 young kids. So this is just
not quite as
Yeah.
isolated, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, our grandparents still come over. We break some rules here and there, so we make it work. Yeah.
Okay. Phyllis, how are you?
It's really, really dragging on, and it's very, very frustrating. But like Chloe, it's how did we used to live, essentially. You know, a lot of the things we wondered about in the beginning, how are we going to cope with this? We've learned to cope with. But it's just the sort of thing, and I wonder about young families in particular. Fine, we can maintain contact via Zoom and everything, but the people that we already know. But how do we engage with new people? Like, how do little children make friends, make new friends? All of those things they're just missing. They're not there. It's going to be a huge gap, I think, in people's lives.
Yeah, people are remarkably resilient. But one of the things I learned yesterday, participating in the Rabbinical Assembly Convention, is when there's a disaster, it takes communities 1 to 3 years to completely recover. And we're going to probably be in this coming back together mode from now starting vaccines. And by we, I mean the whole world, not necessarily us in our community here, but for another year or more. And then when we finally get to that point where we're actually back to whatever the new normal will be, we still have 1 to 3 years. So we're talking about 5 years of living in this limbo.
Well, and the feeling is like, what's it going to feel like to walk back into Shoal the first time? Are we going to be terrified of each other?
Yeah, one of the things I was involved in at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention this week was trying to create ritual and ceremony, things that people can do individually, things that we can do communally. We're far from done, but to say, how do we come back together and how do we mark those moments? Michael, how are you doing, your household? Are you there?
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Yeah. I think Susan's also, she just emailed me, trying to sign on. She had the wrong link.
Okay.
It's just Henry took the computer, so I don't know how to forward the correct link. Reply all. I can only forward it to people who have told me they're having problems. So the only other person we're waiting for is Marcia. Sorry, that was unrelated. Got distracted. Michael's unmuted.
Michael's unmuted. Michael, how are you doing? You're in your household.
Seeing myself. Sorry, I was a little late in joining this. I overhear parts of what people said about struggles with kind of social like kind of living your social life through this quarantine, and it's certainly it's a challenge. I mean, I have a 7-month-old, so in some respects, like I think some things aren't all that different. Being very housebound, yeah. But I can certainly appreciate for older children really having a hard time, like making friends and doing things that the Zoom format is just not conducive to. From
You know, ever
probably
since
ages
this-
3 to
Yeah. I don't know, ever since this started, like week 2, I was like, I'm not doing Zoom. I'm not making my kids have this Zoom upbringing, and we're just not doing it. And we haven't. And I think it's been fine. It's like, I
Mhm.
don't think kids need to be with a million other kids all day long. I think young kids strive when they're with their, or thrive when they're with their families. Like, I think that's more important than anything. So kind of like feel like we're back in the olden times. And I think it's like lovely. I love so many elements about it. And yeah, we're just no Zoom parties, no Zoom play dates, no Zoom anything. I think that's what would kind of mess you up, being a 5-year-old trying to connect with someone on a screen. Just don't
Right.
connect with them. Connect with your parents and your siblings, and you're happy.
Well, if you
Yeah,
think about
certainly.
a time when we lived in a more rural environment, people weren't near each other. You would see, you'd see your family, and you might see your neighbors a couple times a year when there were big gatherings. But you really, like you said, you interacted with your parents and your siblings and your maybe extended family. And that was it, because people were physically distanced from each other in a real literal sense. So that made things very different. And I said
Mhm.
earlier, children are remarkably resilient. I think they're somewhat more resilient than we. And even the school kids who are trying to attend school, and people are worried about how they'll fall behind. Give them a year once we're back, and they'll be caught up. The 1 year that Sean served in is, he's still a U.S. Navy reservist, and he was in Japan for 5 months 1 year. And our younger son Gabi took it really hard to have his father away for 5 months. And the kids were older, so we did check in on at the time of FaceTime or Skype. But I said to his teachers, home needs to be a safe place. I'm not going to fight with him over homework. He's having an emotionally difficult time with this. And we're just not going to do it. If you think he needs to do homework, well, then you're just going to have to take it up with the school. And if he doesn't pass grade 3, he doesn't pass grade 3. I just wasn't going to deal with it. And this teachers, thank God for good teachers who said, we're sure he'll adapt, and we'll make sure he has what he needs. And in the end, homework just wasn't a significant part of his learning that year. He didn't do homework for 5 months, and I said, really, he's doing okay. Like, he'll have to catch up a little, but he will, and that's not a problem. So we spend a lot of time worrying about things. And it's funny because I can now hear him. He's in his room, which is next to mine, and I can hear him clearly on Zoom with a whole bunch of his friends. This was a weekly get together with a group of friends from camp. But of course, he's 20 and not a small child anymore. So it's a little different. All right, we're now, it's 8:20. And I want to get into the topic that we're actually here to discuss, because Passover is coming remarkably quickly. We're going to have another Pesach on Zoom for those of us who are Zooming, smaller seders for those of us who aren't Zooming. And I want to talk a little bit about, this was about kashrut, and also about the kashrut for Pesach. So I'm going to share, a source sheet. Here we go. I'm going to do that for now. Actually, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to pin my video there. Okay. So we have the title for today, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And what about chicken parmesan? And I want to share the source sheet because there are some interesting pieces. So there are this idea of do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. There's a ridiculous joke about this. That's because it appears 3 times in the Torah. And the question is always, why does this exact phrasing appear multiple times? So here's the first time in Exodus 23:19. And you can see lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo. And tivashel is specifically to cook by boiling. It's not barbecue, it's not roasting, it's very specific. And the style, again, we have it not significantly later, lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo. And then we have it in Deuteronomy, which kind of sums up everything. So we can expect that it might have been repeated there. Lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo. And I've put the joke in here for people who look at the source sheet, but the joke says, Moses is up on Mount Sinai and he's receiving the text of the Torah, and God says this phrase, lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moshe says, okay, I got it. So we're supposed to keep complete separation of dairy and meat. You can see it here. And God says, no, lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo. And Moshe responds with, okay, so we need to have separate dishes. Fine. So meat dishes and dairy dishes. And then God says, lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo. And Moshe says, okay, we have to wait 6 hours after eating meat before we can have dairy. And God says, you know what? Have it your way. And there's this idea, the joke, which is clearly got Jewish roots. The joke itself lends itself to the understanding that we as Jews are a bit, and I've said this before, a bit like pack rats. Once we start doing something, we do it forever. And what I have here, we're not going to go over completely, are all of the sources on specifically what is kosher, what is not kosher. What I want to do is go down to, let's pass off, go down to here, because this is Mishnah Chulin. And the Mishnah are all of the laws. So both the laws from the Torah, the D'Oraita laws, and then later laws, the rabbinic laws that are derived from what's in the Torah. And it goes through, this particular piece from Chulin goes through what is allowed. And this one is specifically about cooking milk. So you see it's prohibited to cook the meat of domesticated and undomesticated and birds, right? And what is bolded is actually here. So kol basar, kol basar asur. It's not highlighting properly. I'm gonna leave it alone. Kol basar asur l'vashel b'chalav. Any meat is forbidden to be cooked, and of course, the commentary is added of domesticated or undomesticated animals in milk, with the exception of the meat of fish and of grasshoppers. So there's a idea in Judaism that for everything that's forbidden, there's something that's permitted. So while most insects are forbidden, there are types of locusts, grasshoppers, that are permitted. They're specifically the ones with double jointed legs as opposed to single jointed legs. I do not know how to tell them apart, but there is a Yemenite tradition, because the Yemenite community has never stopped eating them. They're actually considered a delicacy. And in the past decade, as we've used fewer and fewer insecticides in the world, we're seeing more locusts in that area of the world, here as well, of course. We're seeing more locusts appearing, and the elders from the Yemenite community were brought out to speak with chefs and to teach this tradition of which locusts were kosher and which were not. Because if you are having a plague of locusts and there's nothing else to eat, so you need to be able to eat something. And so it turns out that the Torah does allow us to eat certain insects. And so the Israeli chefs have now given a whole new life to the tradition of eating grasshoppers. Anyway, so we have this piece here, fish, and you can see by the time of the Mishnah is going to be the 5th or 6th century, the 5th century really. So you have fish and grasshoppers are certainly considered parv. They can be cooked in milk, but meat, whatever that means in this text, is forbidden. And it says, likewise prohibited to put meat with milk, with cheese and on the table, on one table. The actual halakha of that is interesting. You can, if you wanted to eat something, if you're sitting at a table with someone and one person was having meat, one person was having dairy, the halakha is actually that you should just put something in between you as a visual separation on the table. And this, of course, became important when people started, bringing lunches to work and school and being in places where you might be eating with someone, but different food. Anyway, this goes on to say this applies to all types of meat except fish and grasshoppers. It repeats itself. And I want to go down to, where did it go? So now I'm missing. Let's go to here. There it is. Oops. I want to go down to this source here. So if you look here, Rabbi Akiva, everyone's still there? Just checking. Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was still there. Rabbi Akiva says, cooking the meat of an undomesticated animal or bird is not prohibited by Torah, because as it said, lo tevashel gedi b'chalav imo, you won't cook a kid in its mother's milk 3 times. And Rabbi Akiva says this word kid excludes certain things. So an undomesticated animal, which means you can't have a deer, you can't have venison, a bird, and a non-kosher animal. And Yossi Haglili, whose name you might know from the Haggadah, says it means you shall not eat of a carcass. It says and he takes it more literally. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalav imo, you won't cook a kid in its mother's milk. And so he talks about, you won't have a carcass, you won't have an unslaughtered carcass. Don't exactly, an unslaughtered carcass would be an animal that died on its own, that wasn't shechted. You couldn't cook in milk, but you couldn't eat that anyway. But there, he allows birds, which is subject, it says, you might have thought it would be permitted, it would be prohibited. It says no, because the verse states in its mother's milk, it excludes a bird which has no milk. So if you look at the title of the class for tonight, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, but what about chicken parmesan? Yossi Haglili, and as a result, a number of communities in the Middle East specifically, which followed his ideas, had no problem with something like a chicken parmesan or a butter chicken. And you actually had these mixed dairy and fowl dishes in the Middle East. There's a lot of traditions of cooking things in yogurt, and specifically also in the Arab communities, in the Muslim communities, and also in the Indian communities, where you have a lot of cooking that goes on with yogurts and meats. So the Jewish community would use chicken or other birds, and refrain from using meat of a mammal in dairy. Meanwhile, because we are, one of the things I wrote and I'm now trying to remember if it's actually in there, we as a Jewish community have always considered ourselves one community, but we've never really been unified in our practice. Practices have varied based on who your rabbi is, who is your decisor of halakha, and how things are decided. So we have Yossi Haglili saying one thing and Rabbi Akiva saying the other. Rabbi Akiva becomes this very big name in our texts and in our traditions. And so the traditions of Rabbi Akiva, who says this is forbidden, not biblically, but rabbinically, that becomes a guiding factor from the Middle East to the West. So there's really no post-Talmudic sources. And the Talmud is codified by the 6th century. There's no post-Talmudic sources that allow the eating of a bird with dairy. But it's not actually put in source at all. We know that this from customs and writings we have about communities, but there are also no sources at all until the Shulchan Aruch, which isn't until the 15th century. So somewhere between, the 5th or 6th century, where we have this this particular source, and the 15th century, where we have all of the pieces we have, the ideas that are in that joke, different dishes, waiting in between eating meat and milk, keeping a total separation, and not having chicken parmesan. All of that is very clear in the Shulchan Aruch, which is written as a law code and looks like a modern law code in a sense. It's one of our earliest modern law codes. So we have this developing, and the question comes up, why is this the case? And I'm going to use this also to jump into discussing Passover and holidays a little bit. So somewhere between the time of the Mishnah and the time of the Shulchan Aruch, meat, and specifically chicken or goose, and very much in Europe, certainly in Europe, very much goose becomes a regular dish. So if you go back to the time of the Mishnah, most people lived on a dairy parve diet. The eating of meat was something that occurred on very special occasions. If you were lucky, you might have meat on Shabbat. But even then, usually you had fish on Shabbat. Meat was expensive. Prior to the exile, the only time you had meat was when you brought a sacrifice to the temple. Right, so meat was sacrificed, and then you would eat it as part of the sacrifice. I think we think of sacrifices as things that we give up, but in fact, temple sacrifices were offered, slaughtered there, cooked there, and then part of the sacrifice was offered to the Kohanim and the Leviim as a tithe to support them, but most of the sacrifice was eaten by the person or persons who brought the sacrifice. And Pesach is a perfect example of that. Right? People are told, get together with your family. Right? So it wasn't an individual sacrifice, it was a family sacrifice. And if you're only a few people, or if your kid, your lamb that you're bringing is large enough, get together with other families. So you could have multiple families bringing a sacrifice together, bring the sacrifice to the temple. There it would be slaughtered by one of the Kohanim and then roasted in an open fire. And then you would take the meat from that sacrifice, and you would sit down and you would eat that. And we still have a remnant of this in the eating of the Hillel sandwich, right? You would eat that with horseradish and with matzah. So nowadays, very few of us have lamb. We certainly don't have it in the beginning half of the Seder. But that Hillel sandwich, it says, and he would eat it with horseradish and with matzah. So that was a full meal. So the horseradish was your dressing, like your spicing of the lamb. And then the matzah, which in ancient times and even in some communities today is actually a soft baked bread. So not the hard matzah that we have that's mass produced and can have a really long shelf life, but rather it was soft and much more pita or laffa-like back then. So we had these, you could wrap it up, figure like you had a wrap with strips of lamb, pieces of horseradish, and then your bread surrounding it, and you would eat that together. So that became a very special occasion. Here it was, you made a pilgrimage, you got together with family. These were big deals. But on a regular Shabbat would probably be fish. And the Talmud, when it talks about what you're eating, talks a lot about fish. It talks a lot about grains and other foods that were prepared. I remember studying early on, studying in one of my first classes, and we were learning something, we were studying Masechet Shabbat, and realizing that the Talmud was talking about an early version of gefilte fish. That a fish, taking fish and chopping it up and stuffing it back, and it was this early version of gefilte fish that was a tradition to eat on Shabbat. And we're still doing that today. But as our community becomes one, more affluent, and two, as our society in general starts eating more meat, the society becomes more affluent, we're able to eat more meat, we see this shift in how do we treat meat and how do we treat chicken. So rather than just having fish on Shabbat, now we're having chicken on a regular basis. How do we treat chicken? Where do we buy it? So now instead of going to the temple and having the Kohen slaughter your food for you and roast your food for you, you're going to a butcher. And because a chicken needs to be drained of its blood, it needs to be shechted in a similar way to another animal, to a land animal. And because it needs to be drained of its blood, because we do have a prohibition against eating blood, chicken becomes associated with meat. You buy it in the same space in the butcher shop where you buy your meat. The knife used for slaughter is checked between every single animal, but is not necessarily cleaned and koshered. So there wouldn't be the shochet, the butcher wouldn't necessarily have a separate knife for chicken and a separate knife for lamb and beef or whatever. So over time, because of its association and where you bought it, we move from chicken being an issue of something that couldn't be served in its mother's milk to chicken being connected to meat, and therefore we can't have it with meat. And I'm going to again say we are nothing if not pack rats, in the sense of once we have a tradition, it's very, very hard in our communities to change that, even if the practicalities of it have passed. We are very much a community that tends to say, but we've always done it this way. Even though if you look historically, we can now see that we haven't always done it this way. And in fact, we have sources that tell us that specifically communities did not do it this way. Right, so that's our chicken parmesan. Interestingly, the Ethiopian community, when the world sort of opened up and we interacted more, the outside Ethiopia Jewish community interacted more with the inside Ethiopian community, and Jews came out of Ethiopia and Jews went into Ethiopia. The community there did not have this same separation. And part of that is that the majority of that community had separated from the larger Jewish community after the destruction of the temple. They actually didn't have initially the texts of the Mishnah and the Talmud. They separated from the Jewish community at a time before the Mishnah and the Talmud, before that text that we were just reading was even written. And I remember watching an interview with a member of the community who came to Israel for the first time, sometime in the 60s, and came on a boat and got off the boat in Israel, and disembarked and looked around and was shocked to see that, one, here was a country filled with Jews, because the Ethiopian community very much thought that they knew of the destruction of the temple and thought that they were the only Jews left. And so that there were so many Jews around was one, a miracle. And two, that the Jews that he was seeing didn't look like him. Because growing up thinking you're the only Jews left on earth and your community is the only Jewish community left on earth, and then realizing that there's this entire Jewish community out there. And that means that there are Black Jews and there are white Jews and there are Asian Jews and so on, was a surprise to this person back in the 60s. So really interesting interview to have been able to see. So their community came with very different traditions, and one of the difficulties in coming out of Ethiopia and mixing with the greater community has been the merging, the meshing of Ethiopian traditions and non-Ethiopian traditions. Now, we actually see this in every community. I like to say there are minhagim with a capital M or a capital mem, and there are minhagim with a small mem. So one of the things that we've seen here in North America that's been a big issue and continues to be a big issue, although not as much in the conservative movement as it has been in the past, is the issue of Kitniot and Pesach. So every year, I think every year, so Sean and I both get more questions about what are Kitniot than we do about what is actually kosher for Passover, about what is chametz. So Pesach is, I'm going to quickly glance at the calendar. I just want to get a glance at this. After Purim, Pesach always seems to come way too quickly. So we have we essentially have 3 weeks before we go into Pesach. The fast of the firstborn is Friday morning. Is Thursday. It gets pushed off. It gets pushed ahead because you can bring Shabbat in early. And it's a sunrise to sunset fast. It's actually pushed to Thursday instead of being done on Shabbat, or instead of being done on Friday, because there is an idea that we like to bring Shabbat in early, so we couldn't do a proper fast if we did that. And then the first Seder is Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, after Shabbat, on the 27th of March. So that will be our first Seder. So 3 weeks and a couple of days, and we'll be into Seder. So what is chametz? And I want to encourage you, if there's something I haven't covered, if you have questions, if you have comments, to simply jump in, unmute yourself, jump in and ask. So a Saturday night Seder is always a little tricky because some people will just use matzah Friday for the Shabbat before, but there is a tradition of not eating matzah for the week before. Some say the entire month of Nisan, some say the week before Pesach. So a Saturday night Seder, some will interpret that as Saturday night is really Yom Rishon, the first day of the week, so you could just eat matzah over Shabbat. Others will interpret it Saturday night, you can't eat matzah the entire week before, and so how do you handle, if I have a koshered house on Shabbat, how do I handle the challah? And most people will say you keep your challah, bake the challah beforehand, obviously before you kosher your kitchen. If you bake, purchase it. Otherwise, keep it separate in, hopefully don't eat in a dining room if you have one instead of a kitchen. Keep it in a plastic bag until the moment you're going to have it out, and then make sure after Shabbat meals to sweep up. It is certainly permitted, even if you've koshered your house, to have actual challah, to eat actual challah on Shabbat. Not just permitted, it's encouraged, but it's also acceptable if it's too much to say this, the idea of crumbs and what will happen with that matzah, with that challah is more than I want to deal with, and to avoid doing that. The things that are allowed to be used for challah are the same grains that are allowed to be used for matzah. They are wheat, rye, oats, barley, and spelt. anything else. So when you see a box that says gluten-free matzah, it is actually gluten-free matzah-like food. It is not halachically considered matzah. Nothing wrong with eating it, but it's not considered, it's not actually matzah. It doesn't fulfill the commandment of eating matzah. We don't have a lot of commandments for Pesach. We have don't eat chametz. On the first 2 days, eat matzah. At Seder, you need to ask a question, one question. The most traditional question, of course, is, why is this night different from all other nights? And we're taught that if you don't explain the symbols of the Seder itself, says if you don't explain the symbols being matzah and maror and the Pesach, that we haven't fulfilled our obligations. So we're expected to discuss those things. I want to encourage, and we can talk more about how to do this. I want to encourage that while we're in this weird state of pandemic and people are having smaller seders or private seders, so this is a perfect opportunity to explore different ways of doing seder rather than following along with that idea of we've always done it this way, to look at what is really meaningful for you and what you would like to experiment with. The Seder itself is a ritual that is based on the symposiums, the Greek and Roman symposiums, where you would have people teaching and you would have philosophy discussed and you would have sometimes ritual foods. And that's actually why we lean, because if you imagine a picture of a Greek meal, people are reclining on, I'm sure that's not so, I'm not saying anything that people don't already know. You're reclining on couches and you would eat that way. And so people still recline. There's actually a previous question that says, on all other nights, we eat our meats either roasted or boiled, but on this night, why do we only eat our meat boiled? That's actually not boiled. Why do we only eat our meat roasted? Sorry. And that's actually the fourth question that's in the Talmud, because it relates back to that sacrifice that I mentioned earlier. When the sacrifice would be given at the temple, roasted over flame, barbecued, roasted over an open flame, and this is the only way food would be eaten, or at least meat would be eaten on that night. But coming out of Israel and being, after the destruction of the temple, being exiled and no longer having the ability to go to the temple, decisions were made. So in some cases, we have communities that said we will no longer eat lamb. I know I grew up in a family that enjoyed lamb at other times, but we never ate lamb on Pesach. Pesach was about, we had turkey and a brisket, which led to all other interesting things. Talk about being a pack rat. The first time I planned a Seder, I said, well, of course, we'll have turkey and a brisket. And my husband said to me, who is coming? How many people do you think we can fit in our little, seminary apartment? Which, we had a table that seated 4. Why in the world are we having turkey and a brisket? And realizing we've always done it this way. Both sides of my family managed to have turkey and brisket. And so we just assumed, we'd have that. Now we actually have a completely dairy Seder, dairy and fish, because although not last year and probably not this year, my in-laws and friends with whom we usually share Seder are vegetarian. And so that changed the entire nature of how we thought about food and how we thought about Seder. But with only the 5 of us, actually it's 4 of us, Jesse's in Israel this year, with only 4 of us this year, we're much more likely to go back and say, okay, what do we want to eat, just the 4 of us, because we're not cooking for other people. So that's another thing. If there are traditional foods, and by traditional foods, I don't mean the matzah or do you do parsley for karpas, or do you do celery for karpas or that? But rather the tradition, do you have traditional foods at the meal that you enjoy? And do you have traditional foods at the meal that you eat because you've always had them at the meal, but maybe you don't want to have them this year? Maybe you want to have matzah pizza for dinner. You know, there's no rules about what you can eat. I would also say, because one of the things about this year, it's been a weird year on so many levels. We just celebrated Purim, which for many of us marked that, year of COVID, because Purim was for many communities the last thing that we did together. Purim in Israel this year was a very special Purim, where unfortunately people were indoors for it, but Purim Mishulash, where in Jerusalem, Purim is celebrated on Shushan Purim, which is the day after. But since Purim was Thursday night, Friday, Shushan Purim was pushed off until Sunday. And so they actually had a 3-day Purim. So Thursday night, Friday was the reading of the Megillah. Friday night, Shabbat, they added Al Hanisim in honor, the prayer that's added in honor of the day. And then also before Shabbat, they gave Matanot Le'Evyonim, gifts to the poor, which are given at Purim. And then on Sunday was the celebration of the Purim Seudah, and also delivering of Shalach Manot. So you had this 3-day Purim. A Saturday night Passover gives us a slightly similar celebration. So Thursday becomes Tzom Bachor, the fast of the firstborn, and that's often made unnecessary by the celebration of a siyum. So the fast of the firstborn is celebrated by the oldest, traditionally males, but I personally have found this as an eldest child, found this meaningful to say this is a day when the firstborn children had been, killed by Pharaoh, but also to then realize that the firstborns of the Egyptians were killed in the plague. And I just learned a new interpretation of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which I want to share with you, that looks at this, which says that we always look and say, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And there's the word in Hebrew, or the letter in Hebrew that then goes into the next phrase is a vav, meaning and or, but it can also mean but. So God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh did not allow the children of Israel to go. But I learned of this interpretation that it could be subjunctive instead of conjunctive. God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh still didn't allow the Israelites to go. So that the hardening of Pharaoh's heart becomes an offer to Pharaoh from God of strength, to kind of look past, well, we've always done it this way. We live in a society that employs slaves. If you've ever watched The Prince of Egypt, the animated DreamWorks movie, they do a wonderful job of interpreting Pharaoh. And their character of Pharaoh is trying to live up to the image of his father and what he thinks he owes to his father and the generations before him, right? So if he can't live up to that, then somehow he's letting his entire ancestral line, but also all of Egypt down. And so this interpretation says, if I give you strength, because it's the same root, Chet Zayin Kuf, Chizuk, we offer this to people when they're going through a difficult time. We say, I'm sending you chizuk, I'm sending you strength. It's the same root to say, God sent this to Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh was still not able to make the decision. And it's certainly a discussion I think will happen at our Seder table this year. And what does that mean? And what are we not doing in our world today that maybe we should be? Because we're seeing there's a lot of stuff going on in our world that I think can be discussed at the Seder table. So I mentioned briefly, and I said I'd get back to it, the idea of kitniot. So I said there are 5 grains that cannot be eaten on Pesach except in the form of matzah. So wheat, rye, oats, spelt, and barley. You can definitely find spelt challah. You can definitely find rye challah. Not challah, sorry, matzah, challah too, but rye matzah, spelt matzah, wheat matzah. I have never seen barley matzah, maybe out there somewhere, and I am told that oat matzah is actually not that good. So oats being the one that doesn't contain gluten, for those who are actually gluten-free but still are concerned about eating matzah. Oat matzah is the one that gets created, but as I said, I'm told it's not very good. Along with those 5 grains, that means anything made of those 5 grains that's not matzah cannot be used on Pesach. So, for instance, no beer, no whiskey, and in fact, when we talk about chametz is actually the distilling of foods. So before there was bread, there was beer. So beer is more ancient. And Dalhousie University has a class in ancient brewing. And if you are, I guess if you're not a first year student, if you are of age, as a final project, there's a final paper you have to write, but if you are of age as a final project, you may also participate in the brewing of some of these ancient beers. So, but beer and distilled whiskey, that would be actually the literal definition of chametz. Then we talk about afterwards bread and leavened products. That comes later. And by Egypt, there's already bread being baked. We know that for a fact, but at its very nature, chametz is that distilled or that turning of these grains. So a vinegar that was made from one of these grains would be the definition of chametz. And excuse me, you can see it. The word chamutz is the word for vinegar, whereas the word chametz is leavened, but it really means soured. So there are, however, you can find online different lists of kosher LePesach alcohols. Not encouraging people to drink more, but I just found, and I kept it open so I could share the link. I just found an article in the forward from 2012, and I'm going to post it into the link, which I thought was just amusing, which includes a maror infused vodka. So if you had a potato vodka, you could make yourself, and you could start now and have it ready for Seder night. Doesn't take the place of kiddush, or maybe for kiddush on, if Saturday night is Seder, you could have kiddush at lunch on Sunday. A maror infused vodka, if you had it, there is kosher LePesach vodka, since it's traditionally made from potatoes. So it's not a problem. So I just thought that was a fun and interesting idea. So we have these 5 grains, and then there are all sorts of things from which we make flour. And we have these things are called kitniot. Kitniot are usually translated as legumes, but depending on where your family originated or where your traditions originated, Can also include, beyond beans, it can include rice, it will include corn, it can include, I've heard, garlic, mustard, and other seeds. So it can include all sorts of things. The problem with kitniot, and the problem with the minhag of kitniot, is first, a minhag in terms of a halachic category. So there's minhag small m, which is just what's your family custom, right? Like, so for instance, my family custom is to cover our Seder table with all sorts of toys. And even last year when it was just the 5 of us, and I expect this year again when it'll be the 4 of us, all those toys, all the puzzles, all the little frogs and grasshoppers and Fisher Price animals, and I don't even remember what goes, all of the little pom-poms we use to represent the hail and the blood and all the other things for the plagues, it will all be on the table. And actually, because there's only a few of us around the table, there's so much more room for all of the toys and goofy stuff. That is a family minhag, small mem, that we will continue to do, that I expect my children will carry on to their families when they have their own families in the future. And if we're not together for Seder, and that's fun. That's great to be able to carry on a family minhag, a family tradition. But there's also minhag with a capital mem. This is where the problem of not having capital letters in Hebrew comes through. Minhag is a halachic category that says this is not law, but it is a custom which has the strength of law. The best example I can give you of that is the wearing of a kippah. So people wear kippot, people wear yarmulkes during prayer, and so all the time. There is no law in Judaism that says you must have your head covered. However, this custom of wearing a head covering, either all the time and definitely during prayer, has been around since the 1st century. And it is such a strong custom in our community, and not just in one community, but throughout the entire Jewish world, that it has the strength of law, even though it doesn't have a basis in textual law. So it has, so we don't transgress that, even though we don't have a text that says you should cover your head to remind yourself that there's a higher power and that God is always with you. Now, if you're a rabbi's kid, especially the kid of 2 rabbis, and your name is Gavriel, you will then challenge your parents to say, there's no law that says I have to wear a kippah, but there's a law that says I should wear tzitzit. So if your name is Gavi and your parents are rabbis, you might wear talit katan every day, because there's a text we read in the Shema, right? You will put fringes on the corners of your garment. So there we have a law, but kippah, he's not so interested in, right? So you can see how, I actually think it started to make his parents crazy, but he's decided to run with it, because that's what our children do. So there's an example of a minhag that has this basis in law. Kitniot had been a minhag that was location specific, and all minhagim, so minhagim in general, are often location specific. So something like kippah, which pervaded the entire Jewish community, that's everywhere. It isn't tied to a location. But something like not eating beans or not eating rice, those were actually minhagim that were tied specifically to communities in Europe. This custom doesn't exist in North Africa. This custom does not exist in Greece. It does not exist in the Middle East. It does not exist in the Far East, right? So you don't have a prohibition against kitniot in China. Now, nowadays, or initially you didn't, nowadays, as Ashkenazi Jews moved to China or moved, so China was one of the places you could escape during the Holocaust, or move to Japan or to Hong Kong. You have now Ashkenazim, and also in India, there are 3 distinct Jewish communities in India. One of them is actually Ashkenazi, and these are not transplants. These are actually Indian communities of Jews rather than transplants of people who then immigrated to India. And out of 2 of those, they are more Sephardic in their customs. They do not have a custom of kitniot. One was more Ashkenazi in its customs and did have a custom of kitniot. So you have these places that are connected to where you were. No one has ever been able to say, this is why we have this custom of not eating kitniot. And I've actually done some extensive research on this. No one has ever come up with this. And in fact, our law codes, the Shulchan Aruch and codes before and after, call it a minhag shtut, which literally means a stupid custom. But they go out and say, this is a minhag shtut, but a lot of people do it. So even our law codes say this is a custom that has no basis in fact. My guess, and in everything I've been able to discover, is that first, kitniot are often mixed with other foods. If you think about how markets were, things didn't come nicely packaged, and they weren't made in plants that only processed that one food. Things came in burlap sacks and were sold in communities, from an open market. And so you would have things that would get mixed up. And so you were expected to check. If you're buying lentils, you had to check through your lentils. Even now they'll say you should look through your lentils. You really don't find stones in your lentils anymore, right? You don't find, once in a while, but it's very rare. You don't find wheat in your lentils. But there is still this custom of checking through everything. And I think that people just didn't want to check, and weren't selling it. Once they were saying, everything I have now is for Pesach, I'm going to put that stuff away. It was just easier to do that. Other possibilities are a lot of these things can be made into flours. And so they look like flour. And if I can make that into flour, I can make this into flour. How do I know what's what? And so people stopped eating kitniot. In, what year was it? I wrote it down, 2015. So now 6 years ago, 2015, the conservative movement's law organization came out and said there is actually no halachic basis for the continuation of kitniot, of the kitniot minhag. It created a tremendous scandal as people felt they were almost being forced to eat kitniot. I remember saying to people, no one is telling you have to eat kitniot. They're just telling you if you want to eat kitniot, there's no reason why you have to abstain from kitniot. And so, especially with more and more people eating vegetarian and the concern of eating properly and making sure that they had proper sources of protein that was not just eggs and cheese. So the CJLS came out with a tshuva that said that anyone, not just if you're living in a Sephardic country, but anyone, anywhere, any Jew could eat kitniot if he or she chose to do so. So we spent a long time checking in with each other, and we had a little confusion at the beginning. So we haven't covered everything I wanted to talk about, but I want to offer, since it's after 9 already, I want to offer you a little time to ask questions or make comments about Pesach, about Kashrut, before we say goodnight. So I'm going to stop here and do that, and then I'm also going to say, share with me or with Chloe if you want to talk more about kashrut, if you want to talk about specifics in the future, I'm happy to throw in an extra session or to do something else to continue the conversation. But are there any, specifically with Pesach coming up, are there any Pesach related questions that people have? How to do a Seder, food ideas, whatever you want.
I just on the kitniyot, as you know, we're vegetarians, and my husband is deeply Ashkenazic, so he's got a certain reluctance around kitniyot, but
Right.
we're maybe moving there. I don't think I'm going to find a can of beans on the shelf that says kosher for Pesach. I
No,
will find kosher. So can I, what degree of confidence can I have?
so there are, one of the things that I learned, for those who don't know this, Sean and I lived in Hawaii for 3 years. And we regularly had questions about kashrut, especially at Pesach. And we would consult with one of our teachers, Rabbi Joel Roth, who would always start his questions with a statement similar to, though Hawaii may be paradise, it is not the ideal place if you're keeping kosher. And that was an absolute truth. It was an amazing place. But we learned first you can do dry beans if you're willing to do that, to soak them and then prepare them. Dried beans are fine. You should, as I said, you should look through them beforehand to make sure that there's nothing that's gotten mixed into those beans. But even canned beans, if the only thing in the can is beans and salt, or even just beans and water, because of the way that modern facilities package beans, because they're put into the cans and then they're cooked that way. It's not like they're cooked in giant vats and then scooped into cans and then sealed. Because of the way that the modern facilities work, as long as there aren't other additives. So once we get into preservatives, it's a little harder because we don't always know what the source is. What the absolute source is. But if the ingredients are beans, salt, water, all of those things can be purchased. Water doesn't have to be purchased, but beans and salt you can buy before Pesach without a hechsher and use them. So you can buy canned beans before Pesach without a hechsher and use those beans. There are definitely rabbis and even in our city who will disagree with me. But because my in-laws are vegetarian, we've spent a lot of time researching this. And I can say that with absolute confidence that there's nothing wrong with buying vegetables, canned vegetables or fruit before, as long as the ingredients are only those fruits and salt, really. There's nothing in there that could possibly be a chametz issue. Any other questions?
I guess that question also goes for things like canned tomatoes. Now you can get Pesach tomato sauce, but last year when we were especially terrified to go shopping, just sort of made do with things that were in the pantry already in some instances, as long as it was very, very limited ingredients.
And you can certainly do that again. And like I said, and certainly any can that's just the vegetables and salt, and there are brands out there. It's also now, last year we were all terrified to go out, but this year now they're talking about these different strains and double masking, and who knows where we'll be in a week or 2 weeks. So we may be in the same boat. There is a huge business of Pesach food, and everyone has their favorite items among the Pesach foods that you would probably besides the things that we prepare from scratch that you would probably never eat otherwise, but people have strong emotional ties to specific things. With the exception of that one item that you're closely tied to, there's very little that has to be purchased in terms of specific Pesach food. Matzah has to be hechshered for Pesach. But if you are preparing most of your food at home, if you're preparing from scratch, there are so many other options, right, that you can make. So sugar, most permitted baking supplies, if you purchase them before Pesach, they don't need a special hechsher. So baking powder, baking soda, sugar, salt, all of these things can be bought before. Extracts become a little more of an issue. We this year had some vanilla bean. We actually made our own vanilla, and I have 2 jars. So I have a jar sitting in the cabinet that we'll use for Pesach, which is the first time I've ever done that. It's been interesting. But extracts do need a hechsher. It's sometimes harder to find the natural extracts as opposed to artificial extracts, but they are available. They are around. You have to kind of search for them. But other than that, the things that you would use on Pesach to bake, you can buy almonds before Pesach you don't need a special hechsher on whole almonds for Pesach. So you don't have to buy the 3 times the price Passover hechshered almonds. Now, if you want them pre-ground, ideally you would buy them because we don't know how they're being ground or what else is in the plant. And that's, really the reason we have hechshers today at all is because we have a business model of factories, right? So where we can no longer see, it's not just that the only thing that's produced in this factory is this one item, or I know what's going on in that production area because that's my neighbor. Right? I know that person. We no longer have that ability. The idea of a hechsher is there's someone there who can do what we as individuals used to do for ourselves, but we can't do that anymore because the plants aren't around the corner and they're not our neighbors preparing things. And so we don't have those options. But if you're talking about a place, especially things that are certified gluten-free, something that the problem with that could have oats. Probably not. You have to use some common sense. By creating such a large business of kashrut, we've removed some of the common sense from our shopping. And sometimes it's just easy. One year, Sean was away in the week before Pesach. He came home for Seder, but now 1 year, it was the year he was away for Seder. He was actually away for Seder. So he was away for Seder and the week before Pesach. And the day after he left, I got food poisoning. It was not a great year.
Sorry, I'm just going to chime in quickly. I'd have to go to sleep. I'm so tired with the baby. I wake up all night long, so I'm going to sign out.
It's
But,
good to see you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Good night.
All right, be well.
Okay.
I have to do the same, but thank you so much. It was very thought-provoking and interesting and a helpful refresher.
Right. And like I said, if you have any questions, email Chloe and I'm happy to answer.
Excellent. Okay. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
So in that year, I just went to Sobeys because I knew I could just buy everything in one trip and it would be not a big deal. But most of the time we go, I buy my produce up here. We're right near Kappa's, so I buy my produce there because they have nice produce. And then I'll go somewhere else. And we do a lot of shopping. Oil, any new bottle of oil is fine. No one should ever use cottonseed oil. When I was a kid, it was all peanut oil. Now they say, no, you can't have peanuts. Peanuts are a legume. Legumes are kidney oat. Don't have, so you went from being the only oil available with a Pesach hechsher, and now you can't even have it. The kashrut of things doesn't change. If it was kosher, it's still kosher. But there's no reason why you can't use canola oil or olive oil. just open a new jar. Right, so,
Sunflower oil, latkes dried in sunflower oil or
absolutely,
true treat.
Delicious.
Yeah, yeah.
that's a great idea. I bet the sunflower oil probably adds a nice nutty,
I don't know what it is, but it's just something special about it.
mhm,
I had another piece of question. I can't remember what it was. It's all about food.
all about food.
No, I think I'm okay, and I will someday go to Metro with my triple layer mask with a paper mask inside and do a quick circuit and get what I need, because I'm assuming everything is in the stores now, or should be anyway.
I assume it's starting. Definitely, I haven't been to a store in, I don't know, the last few weeks. We've had groceries delivered, and
Well, I do generally do a grocery pickup with Fortino's, and
Yeah.
they have risen to the challenge magnificently. I mean,
I've
it's
heard that.
fabulous, but they just don't have a great kosher section.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and even the places where you can order online that normally do have a good kosher section, my expectation is that it will be limited because it's one site for all of the stores online,
yes,
right?
yeah.
So though a Metro or Fortino's or Superstore or whatever may have a nice kosher section at your local store because it's in a Jewish community and they know that that's something they should supply, the website won't have it.
Mhm. Well, I did actually have that kind of issue with Fortino's last week. And in my survey, they randomly
Right.
asked me to make comment. I did saying, well, you promised me in your flyer, it was Shabbat candle.
Right.
And it just never came up on the website, and I couldn't get it up. And I noted that. And someone from head office called me and said, here's how we get around that. And here's how you get around that in
Yeah.
future.
That's really
By
nice.
me.
Actually did that.
And it's a $3 charge. They do all my shopping for me, basically, and charge me $3.
Which is really nice.
It's a
Yeah, I
fabulous
thought-
service.
The Superstore is, I think, among the most expensive and the most likely to mess things up from what I've from the anecdotal evidence that I have from my own personal experience and from talking with other people. So, it's going to be interesting, and we're also not sure about supply chains, which we've seen at
Yeah.
different times have been a problem.
Mhm.
And may be a problem for Pesach. We just don't know yet. So that's all the more reason to know that we can cook from scratch, and most foods made from scratch can be made from things bought certainly before Pesach without a specific Pesach hechsher, and safely brought into your house and used for Passover. So we'll see. On that note, I'm gonna
Because
head.
you're tired too. Sorry to keep
I
you.
just wiped out. Luckily, I took off this week to go to the convention, and I've worked Sunday night, Monday night, and Tuesday night. I have worked almost a full day after the convention has ended. Tonight, I have no work. I am not working.
This is work.
This is delightful.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. This
Good
is
to see
always
you, Susan. It's nice
interesting and
to see
helpful.
Thank
here.
Sorry, I usually, it's because during this time, it's like the kids go down and I'm like, okay, what can I do? How can I multitask? So I'm listening.
Totally.
I have a
understand.
post-it note if I want to take post-it notes. And then literally I just like folded my laundry. I did this all this stuff.
Good
And
for
I look
you.
like I'm wearing a big sweater and all this stuff. And I look like just, oh, but I do love listening to this. And it's so funny that we were talking about food.
Mhm.
Because yesterday I was rushing around and I promised my kids, we usually like we keep kosher in the house, but I buy most of the kosher, actually more like probably 95%. And I just grabbed from the store marshmallows because my kids were bothering me about marshmallows. So I grabbed it. So my husband looked at the package. He goes, this has pork gelatin.
Gelatin.
And I'm like, what? And I'm like, oh my God, I did. Does all of them have that? I'm like, I didn't know. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, throw it out. He's like, it's a new thing. I'm like, just throw it out. But now I'm like, this whole time, I'm like, I don't know why I didn't look at the back of that to say that. So I was like, oh my God. So
Don't think about it. Yeah.
I didn't, I just rushed and I just grabbed it. And I was just like, oh my God.
It is very easy to do. And I will tell you, everyone does it, something like that at some point. Right.
Yeah. So
Well-
then, so my kids were like, "So what happened to the marshmallows? They're gone. But I saw them. They're not here anymore."
So then, well, one of the good things is now that there's always extra marshmallows in the store when Pesach is coming. So you'll be able to
Yes.
find some, I mean, they're there. Some of the stores have them anyway, but now you'll be able to find even more.
Do they
Yes.
freeze?
Hmm?
Do they freeze?
I don't know.
You know what? We've only been doing like the hot chocolate come like because it's like
Oh.
winter and we go for night walks because like they're just not getting enough like exercise obviously with
Yeah.
all this virtual school. So we've been doing that, but oh when it starts getting warmer, this hot chocolate marshmallow thing is coming to an end.
Hot chocolate marshmallows all the time. But then there's ice cream. Midnight ice cream. There's something great about ice cream before bed.
I know. It's funny because there's last time, sorry, I know you're just gonna go, but I wanted to tell
Fine.
this one story. There's this one time, so I can't make gefilte fish. I don't know how. So I just bought it. And I'm like, okay, guys, I made something really cool. And I was pretending to, I was like, because I don't usually make it, or Shabbat dessert,
Right.
mostly the soup and a chicken and stuff. But I wanted them to have it and I'll hopefully get the pellet for it. And I'm like, it's a special kind of chicken. So I didn't even want to tell him it's fish. Like, it's a special kind of chicken. My son took one bite. He's like, you're lying to me.
Aw.
So I don't know if there's somehow I can make it taste good.
It's hard, and you can, sometimes it's just a matter of having people try things over and over again. I remember when my kids were younger, seeing somebody, they said, a kid has to try a food somewhere between 5 and 10 times.
Before they really hate it. Yeah.
They really decide whether or not they like it or not.
Mhm.
So sometimes you just keep nudging, or if you really enjoy it, you have it there, and then hopefully eventually they'll taste it.
I really do enjoy it actually, but with horseradish on it, right?
Yeah.
So we're like, but I can't give that to my kids. So I was like, how do I get them to eat it like just the raw plain by itself? So I'll figure it out.
Good
But
luck.
but if you find if there's any good recipes that any of you guys know, I would.
I usually just buy the frozen gefilte fish.
Mm.
And doctor it up a little, maybe throw in some extra carrot or some onion
Mm.
into the pot, but that's usually what we do.
I'll spice it up this year somehow.
Good luck. Yeah, it's not easy.
Luck with that.
Okay. All right, ladies.
Okay, good night. Thank you
Good to
all.
see you. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.
Very good seeing you.
Bye.